welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. Over the past few months, I've been pleasantly surprised at the breadth and range of questions that you're sending in for these question and answer episodes. I kind of launched it as a bit of an experiment, but it's become a really important part of what we do with the Old Front Line podcast. And we're now at nearly 20 different episodes of Q&As, and they're coming in on a regular basis. Thank you for that. And remember, there's two main ways for you to do that, which is to send one in via email or via the Old Front Line Discord server. And there's links to both of those in the show notes for this episode. And one of the things that comes up quite regularly with questions are questions about researching individual soldiers. And I'm either going to do a special Q&A episode down the line where we kind of go through some of the common themes that you ask about, or I might even do a podcast episode based around some of those questions. We'll kind of see how it works out. But if there is a question that you've got in relation to individual soldier research, get that in the next few weeks, and it'll be sometime probably either just before or just after Christmas that I do that episode. So let's get down to this week's questions. And our first question is on email, and it comes from Mark Ebery. Mark asks, I'd be very interested to know more about how the men at the front were paid. I have a rather battered souvenir in the form of a Chambre de Commerce d'Arras 1 franc paper note, and this leads me to wonder whether men were partly paid in French currency. If not, where and how could they obtain local money? Was it simply a case of spending British money in French towns and villages? And the fact that the note I have indicates it was issued locally prompts me to wonder whether such currency was good across the entire Western Front in France, or just in the particular local area in which it was issued. Now, this is a really good question, Mark, because obviously soldiers were paid. They needed pay. You couldn't just send a man to a foreign country and expect him to fight without being paid, without having money that he could, for example, send back to his family, or that he would need to live a kind of a life as a soldier when he was away from that battle area. And when they were out of the trenches, there were opportunities for them to spend a bit of time in a given area, and in those areas there would often be civilians who would sell them things and provide services for them. Food and drink, photographic studios where you could have your photograph taken. There were shops that sold additional food and materials that you might need, require, or want. And there were probably a kind of darker side to services supplied for money that perhaps we won't dwell on too much here, but I think you can pretty much guess the kind of services that I'm referring to. As always, with any history involving millions of men, there is some darker chapters to it, but that is definitely for another podcast, another day. Let's get back to pay. So when we talk about soldiers' pay and them being paid, soldiers carried a pay book, a little red book, AB 64, Army Book 64. There was their basic details in it, who they were, their religion, and all kinds of other information that was useful to them and to the army to identify them as an individual soldier, but also useful to get paid, because there's a section of the pay book in which, when you are paid, that is noted down by the officer that is paying you, so that you can't say, I wasn't paid, or you can demonstrate that you were paid and you were present at a particular moment. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why that information is there. So how did they do it? Well, when the unit was out of the trenches, there's no pay issued in the trenches themselves. There's no shop in the trenches. There's no Starbucks to go to in the support line or anything like that. pay is useless pretty much in the trenches, although there was some illicit gambling no doubt going on, which the army frowned upon. Again, perhaps another subject for another day. But there was no pay issued in the trenches. This was done when a unit was out of the line on rest, and the men could be paraded for their pay. And they would literally have a pay parade, as it was called, where the men would step forward with their pay book. And I can remember many, many veterans that I interviewed talking about this. The guys that were in the infantry, generally this would be done by company. So there would be an officer from that company with some supporting NCOs or warrant officers, and they would have literally a table which the money was on, and the soldier would be stepping forward, and when it was his turn, he would come up to the table, present his pay book, give his regimental number and his name, and they would check that on the roll, and then enter the details in his pay book that he'd been paid, and give him the pay. Now, generally speaking, they were paid around about 10 francs every week, and roughly every 2 weeks. So the average pay parade was about 20 francs at a time. So to answer that aspect of your question, they were not paid in British currency, and they could not easily use British currency anywhere behind the battlefields on the Western Front. At the base areas and at some of the railway stations, and on railway stations going out to the Western Front that took you down to ports, that took you onto boats, that took you across to France, there were places where you could change money up, but on active service that was a lot more difficult. So the men themselves were paid by the army in local currency, in this case on the Western Front in French francs. On other theatres of war, obviously they would have been paid in whatever the currency was there. And the army dictated the exchange rates, which is obviously in their favour. And to give you a kind of an idea of what 20 francs or 10 francs a week could get you, a pint of beer averaged a franc. That could fluctuate wildly, different points in the war. A packet of biscuits with 20 centimes. Remember, there's 100 centimes to a franc. 2 packs of Woodbines would cost you 15 centimes, so if you wanted extra cigarettes. A box of matches was 60 centimes, and a tin of OXO cubes was 75 centimes. So those are kind of random things that I could find from a 1918 document that lists some of the prices. But those prices have got to be treated with a degree of caution, because, again, interviewing veterans, reading the accounts of men who were in the Great War, particularly in estaminets behind the lines when it comes to drink, the prices can go up and down. And the locals got to know that some units were paid more than others, because in the army, not everyone was paid the same amount, just like in civilian life. So soldiers right at the kind of bottom of the rank structure were paid the lowest, and then officers were paid quite a lot. And there's plenty of sources online where you can look up to see what each rank, what each status, what each trade attracted in terms of payment, because you could be a private but you had proficiency badges in certain areas of military prowess, musketry for example, but other things, other skills as well, and that could get you additional pay. That's quite a complex subject, and like I say, there's quite a few websites out there that deals with this. Now, where did the company officer that's issuing the money, where did that come from? Well, the army had an army pay corps whose job it was to pay the army, and each division had what was called a field cashier whose job it was to source money from local banks. At that time in northern France, for example, there were many, as you've discovered with the banknote that you have from the Chambre de Commerce d'Arras in northern France, that there were regional banks. They were much more commonplace and much more commonly used than national banks. But it's the same currency. So if they issue a banknote from that regional bank, it can be used in any other part of France. It's not just exclusive to that area where it's issued. And the field cashier's job was to go to these banks, I would guess, with British currency and agree some kind of exchange so that money was available. Or perhaps someone above the field cashier would source this and it would come down to the field cashiers at divisional level to be distributed. I've got to say that I don't know as much as I'd like to about that kind of process. So if there's anyone that's researched that in any great depth, I'm always interested to hear more about that. So the field cashier passes the money on to the units within his division, and then they have pay parades and the money's dished out. And the soldiers can be paid in franc notes that are from all kinds of different banks. And one of the soldiers' sets of papers that I have in my old frontline archive is of a Corporal Maris of the Artist Rifles, 28th London Regiment. I've got his tin with a lot of his bits and pieces that he picked up on active service. I've got some of his photographs and other documents. He was wounded at Passchendaele in 1917. He was a signaller in the Artist Rifles. But one thing that he kept, every time he was paid, he kept a low denomination note for a bank in an area where he'd been. So he was up at Bailleul in northern France, for example, and he got one there and he kept that as a souvenir. Then he was at Hazebrouck and Saint-Omer and lots of other places behind the line. So he kept those as a kind of record of his service, and I'm sure that he was not alone in that. So soldiers went on active service, were paid in the local currency. British money was pretty much unusable, except perhaps amongst themselves, referring back to the kind of gambling side of it. And very often the attractiveness of the notes and the place names on the notes could also act as a bit of a beacon to their own active service, and some of them kept them as souvenirs, just as you've got one in your family archive. So a great question, Mark. Thank you for that. And once again, it kind of prompts all kinds of little communication trenches, side alleys, for us to potentially go down another day. So let's move on to question 2. Question 2 comes from James, again on email. While exploring Bazentin-le-Petit Cemetery in the spring following your book, I came across the grave of Walter Silence, who had served under another name. I was in another cemetery last week and found another serviceman who'd also enlisted under another name. Was this a common occurrence, and how easy was it to sign up under a different name? And do you know what purpose they might have had by doing this? Well, James, why does a man change his name? Is he on the run from something? On the run from the law, from his past, from his wife, from someone else's wife? Who knows what the reasons were behind a man changing his name to enlist? And those are kind of perhaps fanciful ones. There were others. There were men who enlisted quite a few times, that joined one particular unit at the start, didn't like it, didn't fit in there, so deserted and then re-enlisted under a different name in another unit. That wasn't uncommon. And if you think of all the terrible anti-German feeling within Britain following the outbreak of war in 1914, if you had any kind of German-sounding name, there's a fair chance that when it came to enlisting in the army, you might change that to avoid any fingers being pointed at you or to avoid any difficult situations. And of course, others might change their name because they were too young and they were worried about being found out about, that they were teenage Tommies underage, or that they might be too old, because some men, it wasn't just youngsters who wanted to be in the army and lied about their age at that end of the spectrum. Men who had perhaps served in the army before or were older. Henry Webber from Hawley, for example, put boot polish in his hair and in his 60s managed to get in and got a commission as a lieutenant in the South Lancashire Regiment, and then was killed in the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, age 67. Now, he didn't have to change his name, but there may well have been others who did, again, to avoid difficult questions. So you might ask yourself, how did they get away with it? Well, you've got to remember that the generation of the Great War did not carry the kind of paperwork that we have today to prove who we are. There were no identity cards then. Most men didn't have passports or anything like that. Many of the veterans that I interviewed in the 80s and 90s had never seen their birth certificate, and some of them had baptismal cards and thought that the baptism date on it was actually their date of birth. So there wasn't that kind of infrastructure of paperwork that was there. You could easily slip through the nets and pretend to be someone that you weren't, pretend to be the right age, whatever that was, to get into the army, pretend that you had previous military service. This is something I've seen with a lot of research into men who joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force at the beginning of the First World War, who joined Canadian battalions in Canada, but had themselves been born in Great Britain. Something like 70% of the original CEF were born in Great Britain. And I think word got round that if you had served previously in the British Army, you had a much greater chance of being accepted into the CEF. And a lot of guys said, yep, I was in the Royal Artillery or the Gordon Highlands or whatever it was, and there was no easy way for the Canadian authorities to check that kind of information, because I've researched men who claim service in particular units, and then I've looked into it, and they had no military service whatsoever. So that kind of thing went on. And living in the kind of technological age that we do now, it's so easy with databases to check things out. That just did not exist in 1914-18. So again, that was a way of how men just slipped through the net and were able to change their name like this for whatever reason, good reason, dark reason, all kinds of reasons. And then, of course, you might ask, well, how did the army then find out that they'd changed their name? So what must have happened there? So if you have a soldier whose name was Schmidt, Germanic-sounding name, who changes it to Smith, he is then killed, and he's put in his pay book, for example, or as given when he enlisted, the details of his next of kin, and that's his parents or his sister or his brother, and they have then received a letter saying that Private Smith has been killed, and they then go back to the War Office and say, well, actually, his real name was Schmidt. So that's how you see headstones or names on memorials to the missing, indicating that this soldier served under a different name. And some appear even humorous. I remember looking for the very first time at Major Talbot Papineau's name on the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry panels on the Menin Gate, and looking up to see a soldier of the PPCLI whose name was Small and served as Fry. Was that some kind of in-joke in the family? Small Fry? Small served as Fry? So there's that kind of stuff. Who knows what the story is behind that? But this example of men enlisting and serving and being killed under different names, and that being identified after the war and then being corrected on their headstones or on the panels of the memorials to the missing, is something that is not a rare occurrence whatsoever. Once you've seen a few of them, you will see lots. And some stand out immediately as to why they did it, and then for others, it could be reasons that you could fill a whole series of novels with, really. There are some truly incredible stories once you delve deep into the histories of some of these soldiers who fought and died in the Great War. So thanks for that, James. It's kind of a question that I've answered but not answered, because in many cases we'll never know why some of these men changed their name, and I guess that's all part of how the pages of Great War history never stop turning, because you can look at something like that for a long time and wonder and ponder as to why they did it, and then one day randomly find a bit of information out, and there's your answer. The evolving nature of any aspect of history. So let's move on to question number 3, and this comes from M. Lambert, also on email. This one is a little bit obscure, he says, but what happened to the Buglers during the occupation of Belgium in Ypres, and also is there any accounts of the gardeners of the Imperial War Graves Commission during the war? So what I think our friend refers to here obviously is the Second World War. What happened to the Buglers who played the last post under the Menin Gate? What happened to them when the German occupation began in Belgium in 1940? Well, going back a little bit, obviously the last post at the Menin Gate was something that began about a year after its unveiling, so in the summer of 1928, and it continued not at a set time during that period, but at dusk and in different places underneath the gate, not necessarily in the location where we know it takes place today in that archway that is nearest to the battlefields, with the buglers facing towards Ypres. I've seen photographs of them in the middle of the roadway, facing all kinds of different directions, standing on some of the steps, looking down on the crowds in the roads below. So it was a different kind of ceremony then in some ways, but the buglers were obviously the common thread, and the sound created by those specially made bugles was all part of the power, really, of that ceremony. When the Second World War broke out, it did continue. Belgium was a neutral country in 1939, and British soldiers couldn't cross the border when the BEF came over in the winter of 39-40. I'm sure there would have been many men who would like to have come up and to have paraded at the Menin Gates, particularly perhaps on the 11th of November 1939, but that wasn't possible. British soldiers needed permission from Belgium, from Belgian authorities, to cross that border and come in, and I don't believe that that was given during that period. So the buglers continued playing up until a few weeks before the German blitzkrieg began on the 10th of May 1940, when the Germans invaded the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, and then invaded France at the same time. And this was the beginning, really, of the war in the West, the beginning of the end, because in a very short space of time, all of those nations were defeated. British troops were thrown back off those Dunkirk beaches and the Dunkirk Mole back to Britain, and Western Europe was now occupied by Nazi Germany. And in terms of the buglers, I've heard these stories that a representative of the Last Posts Committee went to the German commander of Ypres, who was put in charge of Ypres after the capitulation of Belgium and the occupation by German forces. He was apparently a veteran of the First World War, and they went to him and asked if they could continue to play the last post. He asked, is it a ceremony for all soldiers who died in the war, or is it just for British and Empire soldiers? And they were honest, they said, well, it's just for the British and Empire soldiers. So he said no. So the bugles were hidden, as I understand it, and remained hidden until the 6th of September 1944, when the Poles, General Maczek's Polish Armoured Division, took Ypres, liberated the city, and the last post was played that night and has been played every single night ever since, without exception. So those who were responsible for the last post on the eve of the Second World War, as far as I'm aware, largely survived it and were there to reconstitute it with those bugles that had been hidden once Allied troops came back to Ypres, liberated Ypres in September of 1944. So that's one aspect of your question. And Dominic Dendoven, who worked at the In Flanders Fields Museum, wrote a book about the Menin Gate and the last post, and there's a little bit about that in there from what I recall. So that's a book to kind of look out for. In terms of the Imperial War Graves Commission gardeners, you may remember that I had an episode of the podcast where we spoke to Caitlin De Angelis, who wrote that fantastic book, The Caretakers, which looks at the experience of Imperial War Graves Commission gardeners during the Second World War, what happened to them, what the Commission's approach to these men serving for the Commission in France as the Battle of France began, and then what happened to them when so many of them stayed behind. Quite a lot ended up being arrested and deported. Some ended up in concentration camps. Some joined the resistance and served with them. And if you look at Caitlin's book and also her social media feed, you'll see quite a lot of stories in there. I mean, she puts this out on a regular basis. And she did a little podcast, which I'm not entirely sure is still available. And if I can find a link to it, I'll put it onto the show notes for this, where she spoke about some of the experiences of these guys that she used in her book. And I think that her book, from what she said when we spoke, it only covers a fraction of the stories that she's got of the experience of these men and women, because many of the men who stayed, rather than being evacuated via Dunkirk, had married French and Belgian women and obviously did not want to leave them behind. And I don't think the British authorities are very good about helping them to evacuate from France and Belgium. So these men really had no choice. They stayed behind with their wives and their families, and many of them paid the price. I've visited the graves of Imperial War Graves Gardners in Krakow, for example. There's quite a few different places where they are buried in cemeteries that were close to where there were prisoner of war camps. So these men ended up in those, and some died of sickness, and I know at least some of them were killed in Allied bombardments of factories where they were being forced to work. So there's that kind of story. One of the most famous, when I first went across to the battlefields in the 1980s, that older generation of war graves gardeners were still there, and they told a lot of stories. And one name that used to come up a lot was Ben Leach. He'd been the gardener at Sayre Road No. 2 Cemetery on the Somme, which is the largest British military cemetery on the Somme battlefields, 7,500 graves, big curved wall at the back, and more importantly, tucked behind that wall, some gardeners' facilities that were not easily visible from the main road, and the Germans never clued onto the fact that they were there. And Ben Leach used them to hide shot-down airmen. He was a veteran of the Great War who had served on the Somme with the Manchester POWs, and he used this tool shed and gardeners' facilities to shelter these shot-down airmen from Britain and the Commonwealth and American airmen as well, I believe, during that period of the Second World War. He wasn't arrested, he wasn't deported, he managed to carry on doing his job. So some gardeners were allowed to continue with their work in some areas, so that when the Allied liberating forces came through there in 1944, and at the tail of them there were representatives from the Imperial War Graves Commission expecting to find the cemeteries of the Great War completely overgrown or destroyed, they actually found quite a lot of them in very good condition. But again, this aspect of the First World War is something that is still emerging. Caitlin's work on this is really, really important, and it's highlighted in incredible depth with some amazing stories, just what happens to that generation of gardeners when another world war came along. So her book, The Caretakers, is highly, highly recommended, and I hope this has answered the essence of your question. So on to our fourth and final question that comes from Linda Woodfeen Michelini on email. She says, I was wondering why the Germans seem to have won all the high ground during the race to the sea. Could or should the British have strategized better and foreseen what difficulties enemy occupation of high ground would present? Now, when you look, as I'm sure you've done, Linda, at any kind of account of many of the battles in the early period of the First World War, it always appears that the Germans have the high ground. In most cases, that is true. And it's true for a number of different reasons, because during those battles of 1914, when the war was very mobile and the Germans realised that they were not going to reach Paris with the Schlieffen Plan and then not going to reach the Channel ports with the so-called race to the sea, they looked at where they were on the battlefield and thought, our only choice now, our only option is to dig in. And if we dig in on this flat plain with the French or the British in front of us on the top of that hill, that's not going to be so good. And they looked around, and if there was a hill to withdraw to, or a piece of rising ground to withdraw to, they then moved to that. But also, if you actually look at some areas, it was the British or the French had already captured the high ground. So if we look at the Ypres salient, for example, at the end of the First Battle of Ypres in 1914, in most cases it's not the Germans that have the high ground. Then it's the British and the French and the Belgians who are alongside them. And that high ground, so-called high ground in what is relatively flat Flanders, is then taken by the Germans, who see the significance and importance of it, using poison gas in the Second Battle of Ypres in April and May of 1915, and then they occupy that high ground and use it to dominate the battlefield for the next 2 years. And if we come down to the Somme, and that is a battlefield in which high ground is all important. I mean, it's important on every battlefield, but that's the one where we read about British troops marching up the Thiepval Ridge with the Germans at the top, or the Hawthorne Ridge, or the Redan Ridge, or the rising ground at Sayre, wherever it is. And we think, well, the Germans, again, they're in occupation of all this high ground. How did that happen? Well, there they'd fought the French in 1914, and lines had been established, and the French had tried to push them off some of this high ground in the battles of late 1914, or during some of the battles here in 1915 on the Somme, but still they occupied the majority of high points. The German philosophy, you've got to remember, for most of the war was a defensive one. And if you're going to succeed in a defensive war, you need the best terrain to allow your defences to inflict the maximum number of casualties upon the enemy, which normally means occupying some high ground where you have the dominant view. And the British could have strategized better at the beginning of the war, but you've got to remember that the British Army in 1914, during that key period that led to the establishment of the Western Front, was very, very small. When the front went static in 1914, the British front was less than 30 miles long, on a Western Front that was now 450 miles long, the bulk of which on the Allied side was defended by the French army. They were the senior partners in 1914, and in many respects the senior partners for most of the rest of the war. So there wasn't really a lot the British could have done in that early phase of the conflict to change this, and they were then occupying a bit of the line from the south of Ypres at the village of Saint-Éloi, down across the border near Armentières, home of the famous Mademoiselle, and then down into the flatlands of Artois, ending close to the La Bassée Canal. Now, while some British battles were fought in that area in 1915, these great battles that we think about at Passchendaele, on the Somme and Arras, those were battlefields that at that particular point we did not occupy. The ground east and northeast of Ypres in 1914-15 was part of the French sector until the Second Battle of Ypres during that April-May 1915 period, when who defended Ypres changed. But at the very heart of your question is this understanding of just how important so-called high ground or actual high ground was. And really, particularly in Flanders, the whole war there was a battle for the possession and repossession of this so-called high ground. And when we go to the Somme, I think I said in a recent podcast about how the Somme wasn't a billiard table that many people think that it is. It isn't. It's rolling chalk downland, and we see that on the Somme, at Arras, Cambrai, other parts where the Hindenburg line were. And if you go right across those battlefields of 1918, you see how the ground changes from the Somme and the valley of the Somme through to the valley of the Selle and the Sambre Canal and the approach to the Belgian border. But the further you go down the Western Front, you see more and more just how significant ground is, and landscape, territory, contours, geography, geology, all the stuff beneath it, how all of that is important. And if you think there are parts of the British front where there's so-called high ground, once you get down to the Vosges and you stand in those trenches at Lelonge, looking down the slopes where French soldiers attacked in 1914, it's just incredible to see the kind of terrain there was there and how that influenced the outcome of the battles in what was mountainous territory. So terrain, incredibly important, but I think the answer to how it affected the outcome of some British offensives in the early phase of the First World War wasn't really down to the lack of foresight by the British, because in some respects no one had that foresight. They'd prepared for a war of mobility, not a static war, and certainly not a static war on this kind of scale. So thanks, Linda. That's a brilliant question that's kind of opened up another great discussion about the importance of the landscape of the battlefield of the Great War, whether that's the Western Front or any theatre of war. So thanks for this week's questions. Keep those questions coming. Details of how to do that in the show notes, and I'll see you again soon for some more questions and answers on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.